Pull yourself up a chair and join us at the Energy Roundtable.
Welcome to the Energy Roundtable. This is a special Canadian federal election version of our roundtable. And to join me, none other than Lisa Katz. Lisa, welcome.
Hello, Matt. Happy Friday. How are you today?
I'm good. I'm excited to talk energy and politics. Two of my favorite topics to speak about a lot, maybe not sensically, but let's get into it for our U.S. listeners. This will be a glimpse into the Canadian federal energy policy landscape and our parliamentary system, multi-party, influenced by the Brits. And for our Canadian listeners, hopefully this is of value. And I'm going to let Lisa drive most of it. She's going to talk through from an article, some policy statements, and I'm just going to kind of respond as we go. So Lisa, the floor is yours. Thank you for digging this up, and thank you for leading us through this.
You're most welcome. Well, I was looking through for basically an article that would focus on kind of comparing the parties just for my own purpose, right? Because I mean, there's been so much movement and kind of different discussions kind of circulating around the news lately. I thought, well, I got to be a little more up to speed on this. So anyways, this particular article, well, it's more of a blog post actually, and it's from Smart Prosperity Institute, and it's titled Election 2021, A Comparison of Climate Policy and Federal Party Platforms. There are several topics of discussion, so this will be the only article that Matt and I will focus on today because it'll take a big chunk of time. And I guess I'll start by talking about some of the comparisons with emission targets, since that's, a pretty big one. So I'm going to try not to read too much from here, but at the same time, in order to cover everything, I think I might have to. So the Liberals are promising a 40 to 45% emissions reduction, which is aligned with the current Paris target, which was revised in April. The NDP will be going further, promising a 50% emissions reduction by 2030. And the Greens promise a 60% emissions reduction by 2030. Throughout this, the Greens are not really kind of focused on, but nonetheless, that is part of that particular segment. And then the Conservatives, meanwhile, have promised to meet Canada's past Paris target of 30% emissions reductions, indicating a rollback of Canada's current target. That's the first one.
Okay. So you got, just to recalibrate for those who aren't familiar, you have kind of moving right to left on the political spectrum. You have the Conservative Party, you have the Liberals kind of in the middle. They are the incumbent. They called this election. And then we have the New Democratic Party, the NDP. And on the left, on the very far left, kind of generally speaking, we have the Green Party, whose mandate is climate. They have a small representation in Parliament. The Liberals in the middle have kind of an incumbent minority government, and then we have we also have a party only in Quebec, but they're obviously not in this article. I guess they're not a federal party really. They're just focused in the province of Quebec. So as expected, I think you kind of have it falls kind of in line. You have the Conservatives scaling back a little bit, presumably because of how they feel that environmental targets, emissions targets would impact industry and growth. The Liberals kind of staying the course, and then the NDP and the Greens on the left pushing it. The reality is, I think all of them are aggressive targets. And it's really, yes, you need to set the target, and then the question is, what are they going to do to underpin that and help us, drive innovation and drive investment so that we get towards that. That's the real key question, which, I mean, they're not going to answer in a campaign, but that will be the new government that's formed. How are we going to move towards that? That's my thought on it.
Yeah, exactly. I think the policy is a big thing. And I think the other piece that they don't touch on with each of these different kind of topics or areas we're going to get into today, they don't really talk about what the effect is of cost, right? I mean, this, when you think about it from a business perspective, you can easily say, oh, CEM wants to open an office in maybe Africa or, I don't know, Europe, but there's a cost that's associated with that. So, what does that look like? And as voters, sometimes we're missing that element, right? Unless we're really digging into stuff and can kind of see what people are talking about there. So the next one is climate industrial strategy. I would say that the Liberals and Conservatives are probably close to the equal here, but I'll go through it. So the Liberals have pledged $8 billion to a net zero accelerator to make strategic investments in domestic net zero firms. In the last budget, the Liberals also announced their intention to create an investment tax credit for new carbon capture, utilization, and storage projects. Of course, that topic is really hot right now, as well as new hydrogen projects to crowd investment into these sectors. And then the party has also placed a specific bet on the extraction of battery minerals, committing $36.8 million in the last budget to build production and refinery capacity. And then, though the policies are unreleased, the NDP has committed to establishing a national industrial strategy to build up a low-carbon manufacturing sector in Canada. And it looks like the party platform has also highlighted a strategy that's focused on procurement to develop the clean sector. And then the Conservatives have set their sights on small modular reactors, otherwise known as SMRs, as a sector for development, pledging $1 billion to help research and deploy the technology in Canada. CCUS is also a high priority for the Conservatives, with $5 billion earmarked to support research and development in the sector, part of which will be to form CCUS project tax credits. And then it goes on to continue to say to promote the bioenergy economy, the Conservatives also plan to make the use of wood waste and agricultural waste streams eligible for carbon credits where carbon neutral.
Now we're talking.
Yeah.
So before you got to that last point, I was going to say that the Liberals kind of have the leg up here because this is something they've rolled out. It is a plan. I mean, you said the numbers. They all resonated with me as familiar numbers, and we know that the $1.5 billion Clean Fuels Fund is in motion, and ironically, the submission date is like days after the election happens. And so, in terms of, some momentum around something real and something tangible, like I think the leg up is there. But at the end, when you talked about the Conservative stance, you got me on the bioenergy piece, of course, my first love, as listeners know, on the biogas side. And so, really, I think and I think they talk about that, getting this, getting protocols, national protocols around carbon, carbon reduction, carbon, capture strategies, that the industry that can drive behavior. I think that's the key of government here, is let's get a protocol for this stuff. And then private industry and large industry, they will drive. Everybody's moving that way. Just give us the tools and the framework. Yes, some incentivization on newer technologies is good. Give us the framework so that we can roll and do these projects ourselves and just stay out of the way, right? So we'll see. I think on this one, though, I do have to give the leg to the Liberals. And I'm going to Calgary next week. This will probably, come back to haunt me. But I got to the Liberals because of, the incumbency piece, and they are starting to make steps towards this.
Yeah, exactly. And I kind of agree. I mean, they're, in my mind, they're sort of side by side, maybe with the Liberals taking a bit of a lead there. And, as far as the NDP goes, as far as I'm concerned, they haven't really started to identify what technologies are really going to be put in place. They haven't really committed to things, as, the policy details are unreleased. So, I think the Liberals and the Conservatives are definitely trekking ahead there. The next one is called Clean Export Strategy. I think from what I can read, almost all the parties are generally aligned here. But again, I'll review it. So the Liberals have committed to $21.3 million over 5 years to help Global Affairs Canada promote the export of Canadian clean tech. The Conservatives are emphasizing boosting the liquefied natural gas or LNG sector, as well as promoting the export of Canadian uranium and nuclear technology. And then contrast with all of this, the NDP, who would promote Canada's forestry sector and improve market access for added value wood products as an export-oriented, climate-aligned growth area. All three parties are agreeing on the importance of Canada's aluminum sector. The Conservatives' platforms highlights the potential that Canada has to export low emissions intensity aluminum abroad, while the NDP focuses on the potential for import substitution in government procurement. That's essentially. And then the Liberal government announced a $20 million investment in, I'm not sure how you actually pronounce this, if it's actually Elias or if it's just the letters ELYSIS to research and commercialize zero carbon aluminum. So it looks like aluminum is a big topic in terms of the export strategy. Is sort of what this piece is kind of really touching on, I think.
Yeah, and I think, I don't know the oil and gas space as well as maybe I should. I mean, we're blessed with a lot of resources, oil and gas, forestry, a large opportunity with, large renewables in wind and solar and hydroelectric. How do we figure out how to export this? Energy is with the exception of oil and gas, is hard to export. But with that, you mentioned LNG, like that's really, really exciting. How do we get that going? Is hydrogen something that's energy dense enough that we can figure out how to export that? And then the big one to me is this technology export. How can we take Hydrogenics, Canadian company, go back to CANDU reactor. I mean, there's a lot of folks in between. Many people that I'm likely not going to remember. But how do we export that know-how? And that's really where we're going to drive jobs and we're going to drive value to the Canadian economy, is exporting. What's one thing, the resources, but exporting the technology and the know-how. That's big.
Yeah. Yeah, totally agree. Okay, so the next one is zero emission vehicles, otherwise known as the ZEV market. So I think for the most part, you'll probably notice the Liberals are probably running ahead here, then it's NDP and Conservatives. But basically the Conservatives are requiring that 30% of light duty vehicles sold in Canada by 2030 will be ZEVs. The Liberals have set a more aggressive target, requiring 50% rather than the 30%. Of all passenger vehicles, not just light duty vehicles, by ZEVs by 2030. And then the NDPs, they've not set a 2030 target. They would require that 100% of new car sales be ZEVs by 2035. And so the Liberals have set a more aggressive 2035 target, requiring that the sale of all new passenger vehicles by ZEVs by 2035, not just cars. And then the Conservative platform does not have ZEV target or a commitment for 2035.
So
that is,
to clarify, ZEV is zero
emission vehicle. That's right. So think of, your electric powered cars. You think of, you could be hydrogen cars as well, right? From those kind of fuel sources. I will say that what's interesting about this particular thing, this particular subject, is you and I and a lot of our listeners know, that as more electrification happens, we start to maybe get into more electric vehicle cars. We still have to build we have to have the capabilities of charging all of those vehicles, right? We have to have the infrastructure. And so like somebody on the outside of our sector, our business might look at that and say, oh, well, this is kind of interesting. Oh yeah, this is great. But there's some pros and cons to that, right? Like, we already know that when some of the nuclear refurbishments take place, we're going to be power short. And I think that, I don't know if that number has changed, but it was about 2,000 megawatts, give or take. Right. So what effect will it have? We're talking about, 2030 here, right? Like, we're not talking about, 2040. So because everything's still a little bit unclear with the ISO in terms of where some of that extra power is going to come from, and they've got some kind of ideas, but because that's not clear, this makes me a little bit more nervous, because I'm thinking, well, now you're adding all of that, you're adding additional load there. And so it sounds good, but there are other repercussions in the system that we have to be thinking about.
Yeah, I guess my question is, and I think some of the policies were either tax incentives or rebates. To me, the thing is, that market is going to come, and I think we're beyond the early adopter stage. I don't think we really need to drive a lot of money into that market, because we're at the point now where at $1 more, more than $1 a liter of diesel, you have the more, the heavier duty stuff. It makes sense just on economics alone, right? And on the EV side, the same is true, right? That the prices continue to come down. So, I agree with you. There's some technical barriers to solve, but I think this is, driving, adoption of this widespread through government intervention. To me, this doesn't make sense. Like, yes, it's good to have targets and figure out how to support that, but not through, just cutting checks personally.
Yeah. And there are, just realistically, there's so much more charging stations. Like, there used to be the issue of, oh, well, maybe, we don't want to, you don't want to get an electric car because you don't have that charging station in close proximity. You're gonna, end up kind of panicking to get to a recharge station. But that's different now. Like, there's a lot that has improved in that sector, right? Okay, I'm looking at the timing, and I'm going to skip one of the ones that I had put up here. Okay. And go to probably one of the larger ones that come along with, the emissions targets that I covered earlier. So this one is carbon pricing and border carbon adjustments.
Aha.
We've heard a lot about carbon pricing. Obviously, most of us in the space know what the Liberals' plan is, but not all of us maybe understand what the Liberals and the NDP are going to be doing. So let me go through that. The Conservative platform has made its pitch for a carbon pricing system with an initial price for consumers and small businesses, is the key word here, of $20 rising up to $50 by 2030. Instead of a tax return, all funds would be delivered to Canadians and small businesses through a low carbon savings account. And then the Conservative plan also contemplates, but does not commit to at this stage, a carbon price of $170 per ton for industrial emitters by 2030. So that's actually somewhere more in line with the Liberals are doing, right? Which I'll come to now. So the Liberals have held to the carbon pricing plan they released at the end of last year, with a carbon price raising to $95 per ton by 2025 and $170 by 2030. And the NDP proposes to continue the existing policies of the Liberals, but to price in more emissions from industrial emitters under the output-based pricing framework. And then from a border crossing or carbon perspective, both the NDP and the Conservative platforms also highlight the potential of border carbon adjustments to build out Canada's carbon pricing scheme and crack down on carbon leakage. So there's the kind of various reviews, I will call it, of the topic.
As I listen and I kind of listen to you emphasize that the Conservatives are focused on the consumer and not big business. And again, caveat, I'm not an economist by any stretch of the imagination, but it strikes me a little bit like what I think New York State has done with electricity prices, where if you're a residential consumer, you pay significantly higher dollars per kWh for electricity than you do as a industrial. And that allows the industrials, for whom those energy bills are a significant portion of the world, it allows them to continue to operate and continue to have good paying jobs and continue to drive money back into the local economy. Whereas for those of us who have a house, yes, I realize that the rising cost of energy does impact us, but it's, in contrast to a mortgage payment or in contrast to other things, it's not significant. And so if I'm reading this Conservative platform right, I think what they're saying is, we'll focus on residential and consumer and commercial consumption, and we won't focus so much on, large industrials. And I see it kind of aligned to what they've done in New York State, and I kind of like that. I think it's a strategy that allows, job creation and job sustaining to continue to happen. And yet hopefully will continue to drive, behaviors on a distributed front. I realize that big corporations don't get a vote in a democratic process, and the people that live in the houses do. That makes it hard. But I quite like that side of the plan. The important thing for me is that all of them are up and to the right in terms of pricing, right? So that provides some. So yes, the Liberals were way out ahead instead of $170 a ton. But as my mother used to say, you need the extremes to move the middle, and now everybody's moving with them, right? Yeah. So that's predictability, I think, for business.
What's really interesting, I won't name the client obviously, but Martin and I were at a couple of site visits last week, and we asked the client, what are you thinking about the Liberals versus the Conservatives, the framework, for carbon pricing? And he said, Liberals all the way. And we said, well, that's interesting, because $170 a ton imposed on industrial clients, wow. Really? What's your feeling behind that, or the reasoning behind it? And he said one word: because it drives innovation. And he's afraid that, unless you have at this stage, because of the so-called climate emergency that we're in, right? You see all of this stuff happening. He's afraid that it won't drive enough innovation fast enough. And so he thinks, you set it up high and you make it very aggressive, and the industrials, because they're a big part of our systems, in terms of pollution and CO2 emissions, that'll drive innovation faster, because it's still going to take a few years for people to get on board and to move things even faster than what it has been moving.
Right.
So, when you think about it from that perspective, I kind of get it. But it will be interesting to see, Yeah,
this one's a hot potato, and unfortunately, for all of us involved in the election, none of this stuff is really getting too much play because, we're all talking about protests and we're talking about, vaccines and masks and mandates and all that stuff that, hopefully will be behind us, early on in this next government's term, right? So
That's right.
Yeah, good. All right. Well, that was the kind of the last big one in the article?
That was the last. Well, there was a circular economy, but that's not as big, I think, as the carbon pricing.
Right.
So for our listeners and those who are interested in checking out the full article, or blog, I should say, rather, we will have that posted, of course. So feel free to, take a look at that if you want to get some of the finer details of the article.
Awesome. That was great. Thank you, Lisa. Really appreciate you leading us through that and an opportunity to talk through some of the topics. And we will conclude, as always, with our face-off. And I think the topic is, who will you vote for in the election? No. Our ever-present producer, content king, Mark Charbonneau, is here to lead us through our face-off. Welcome, Mark.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. So, face off, we pit you both against each other, whether you agree with your side or not. You just have to come up with some compelling arguments. And I am going to throw a curveball into this one. So Lisa, don't hate me for this. But the topic is still social media, but it's while running a campaign. So the pros and cons of social media. Well, so put yourselves in the position of like the politician, I guess. And so you're running for government, and how can social media positively or negatively affect your campaign? So you don't look too happy, Lisa.
Well, you know me, I really prep for these things. So now you caught me completely off guard. I'm going to be going. Blah, 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 blah.
Well, I think
I'll find a way to get through it.
Hopefully, you can apply the things you were thinking about, and you sort of jotted down to this curveball that I've tossed at you. So I just flipped, and I will let Matt call it. Heads or tails, Matt?
Heads.
It is tails.
Okay.
So Lisa,
I'll let Matt go first.
See that.
I'll let Matt go first.
Okay, so Matt, pros or cons of social media whilst running your campaign?
I will say, are we saying pros or cons for the candidate or for the voting public?
For the use of social media, how can social media positively or negatively affect your campaign? And this could be bonus points, Lisa. If you want to still stick with straight up social media, I will allow that. But bonus points if you can sort of skew it as you're running a campaign. So,
all right. Well, I will go first, and I will say that social media is a net benefit for a campaign. I don't know if that's the right. I could have gone either way. But it's a big speakerphone, right? And so for the candidate, it's an opportunity to get your message out. It's a big speakerphone, but it's also direct dial, because the way social media works, you can tailor your message very narrowly to very specific portions of the population. And so we are about to elect 350 some odd members of parliament here in Canada. So there are 350 geographical ridings which each have a candidate in them, and each of those ridings are a little bit different. And so you can, with the social media tools that we have, particularly Facebook, I think Facebook's the big one, maybe Instagram, you can get really narrow on where your message shows up. And so, yes, that's a lot of work. Yes, it costs money. But I think, the ability to get laser focused on who you're targeting it and create different content that aligns with, different folks, I think that's really, really important. And there's a lot of different platforms. You can get written out, you can get video, you can get pictures, you can get audio, all the above. So it's a real good way to get a lot of the message out there. And I think for the voting public, and I'll pause here, I think for the voting public, social media, it doesn't really change us, it just exposes us. And that can cut both ways, but I think it gives an opportunity to give a clear picture of who the candidates are, both in your local riding and broader. And so I think it's good if used well for the candidates, because it's a platform and it's a mouthpiece and it's a direct dial, wide and narrow, and it's good for the electorate because it gives us a clearer picture of who we're dealing with in real time.
Okay. Again, Lisa, I apologize. I'm sure you spent some time, mulling this over a little bit.
It's okay. Don't you worry, Mark. Don't you worry. I'll get you next time.
Okay.
Okay, so the cons of the bad stuff. Well, I loved Matt's word, like exposing, because he kind of gave me a little bit of a nudge there, right? Like an in. But, I think the big issue, when you're running a campaign that's negative is not everything can be deleted. Like you kind of hope that it can be deleted, especially if you put something out there that you don't really want. I think of people like Donald Trump, right? Or you think of some of the celebrities. Okay, this is not, running a campaign necessarily, but they say things they don't mean to say. And all of a sudden, bam, it's out there, right? And there's a lot of negative attention. I think of, Doug Ford. I think of, I think of a lot of this negative attention and the fact that sometimes things can get blown way out of proportion. And I mean, look at the COVID situation is a great example, whether it's vaccines or we're talking about masks, we're talking about this, there's a lot of misinformation out there. And I think when you're running a campaign, you want it to be precise. You want people to understand what your views are, what you're fighting for, and, everything else around that. And sometimes that can be taken wrongly and blown out of proportion in a direction you don't really want it to take. So I think that's, probably one of the biggest things. It can also be a little bit of an invasion for privacy too, right? Like when you think about, if I was out there, I'm running a campaign and, news stations are right in my face all the time. And there's a lot of pressure put on you. So like, it's a good thing in the sense that you get that exposure, but at the same time, that exposure can be bad because, maybe I don't have makeup on that day, or I don't know, maybe I'm just not my best and it's going to get exposed regardless. Right. Yeah. Can I think of anything else?
While you're thinking to that last point, I think there's an implied waiver of privacy when you run for public office. I think in today's day and age, you got to know that it's going to be out there.
Yeah.
So
things often get taken out of context too, like you were saying. Like they take snippets of what you've said and make it and spin it and make it something that it actually wasn't. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. I think I'll leave it there, but for bonus points, I'll talk about, some of the cons that I think just are generally thought about with social media. And I think the biggest issue that I have is more so with youth that are on social media. The fact that I can, maybe pre-COVID, but I would sit in a coffee shop, for example, and I would see, 4 or 5 or 6 kids surrounded across or around a coffee table. And they're all on their phones. They're not talking to one another. And so and that's just been further amplified, of course, with COVID and, everything else that kind of goes along with that. So that piece I don't like. And the other piece I really don't like about social media is and this could be with women, this could be with young boys, this could be just, generally speaking across the board. But the effects that it can have on people's mental state, the depression, the comparisons, how many likes did I get, like that sort of thing. And then the third thing I will say is it can be a complete drain on time. I personally, and I'm not just saying this to get some, as we say, KA, for the listeners won't understand that, but Matt will understand what KA means. I'm not just saying this because to get Matt's to get some kiss ass, basically, with Matt. But I don't even look at social media during the day while I'm at work because it's completely distracting. So I look at it like literally at like 8:30, 9 o'clock at night. It's, once a day and that's it. Because I do find it's a big time sap. So I rambled on quite a bit there, but those are my views. There you go, Mark.
Yeah, I agree though, especially with the dinner stuff. When we go out for dinner, we have a rule, even with my wife and I, there's no phones. No, and especially with the kids and at home as well. Obviously, we're sitting at the dinner table. There's 0 screens, 0 anything allowed ever. Right? That's just like our sort of golden rule. So, okay, so this is a tough one for me because I obviously use social media quite a bit. But I honestly think, especially even for campaigns, I think that it actually does less good when running a campaign. Only this day and age. I mean. It shouldn't, but so I think I'm going to have to go with Lisa for this one. Just because all the smear campaigns, that's the one thing I can't stand is half of them spend more time saying what the other candidate does wrong than what they plan on doing right. And it's more smear campaigns and more just filling your head with garbage than it is trying to propose what they're going to do right. Anyways, that's my experience. So. Yeah, that's all I have to say about that.
Well, me and my buddy Gary are taking issue with your guys' stance on social media. Gary Vaynerchuk, for those who aren't informed, but yeah, good debate. I think it's, it is a tool of our modern day, and like any other tool, you could build a house or you can kill somebody with the same tool, right? And so I think that the same is true for social media. So
yeah.
Well, for those who are eligible to vote, get out and vote on the 21st, right, of September.
I feel like it's the 20th, but I could be wrong. Actually, I should double check that. I feel like it's the 20th.
Let's double check that while we're still on. So we don't want to have fake news go out on this channel. But as my American friends say, go out, vote early, vote often. I was reminded of that yesterday. But thank you both for your contributions and a good debate. Thank you, Lisa, for walking us through all those different policies. And either people who listened had fun or are more educated as a result of this time together. And Mark, what is the date?
September 20th does look like voting day.
Voting day, September 20th. Yep. Get out there and vote if you can. Vote early, vote often, and get educated ahead of time. Thank you both. Have a great long weekend. It's Labor Day up here, and rest up. Back to school on Tuesday. Can't wait. See you guys.
Yay.
Have a good one. Have a good weekend. Bye.
Bye, everybody.